That's yours, right?
If a short little guy looks like me comes to the door, maybe let him in. Does this work? Thank you again for having me back. I'm thrilled, really, to be back at the Corner Bookstore, and I'm thrilled to see so many familiar faces. I appreciate you coming out on a January night. I personally prefer to hibernate until about late March, so I'm very thankful about that. I also wanted to extend a special thanks, real briefly, to Janine for all of her support the past 3+ years as I was working on this book. I might as well mention that we started dating shortly after my last reading here for The King's Best Highway, and now we live together, so hopefully this reading goes as well as that one did. Although, if it does, I guess I could be in a little trouble later at home. The book is A Curious Madness, an American combat psychiatrist, a Japanese war crime suspect, and an unsolved mystery of World War II. Now, I'm actually going to start with the mystery and work my way back to talk about the combat psychiatrist and the war crime suspect, and then touch on the mystery just a bit more at the end, and then take any questions you might have. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of the Nuremberg trials that followed World War II, but you might not be aware that there were similar trials conducted in Japan after the war. They called them the Tokyo trials, and some people even actually referred to them as Japan's Nuremberg. Now, there were 28 Class A defendants who were part of the Tokyo trial. These were former prime ministers, heads of state, military leaders. They were really considered the 28 individuals most responsible for Japan's rise to war, its imperial rise. The star defendant was Tojo Hideki, who had been prime minister when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. Now, the only civilian among the 28 Class A defendants was an ideologue and a writer named Okawa Shuemi. This is Okawa right here. Okawa was considered by the Allies to be the civilian brain trust of Japanese militarism. He was kind of the mind that had directed the country's military might. And even if you didn't know that Okawa was the lone civilian on trial that day, you would have immediately realized on the first day of the trial that he didn't quite fit in with the rest of the group. And I describe his rather eccentric entrance on that first day of the trial on the first page of the book. Okawa Shuemi arrived at the arraignment looking every bit the madman. It was May 3rd, 1946. The bus from Shugamo prison dropped off the defendants at 8:30 in the morning. Okawa entered the courtroom wearing traditional Japanese geta, which were wooden clogs, and a wrinkled light blue shirt that looked like a pajama top. He took his place at the center back of the 2-row prisoner dock that faced the international panel of judges. In front of him was Tojo Hideki, the former general, recognized the world over for his flat, bald head and round spectacles. Tojo wore a bush jacket and the sober expression of a man resigned to his execution. In fact, of all the defendants, only Okawa lacked the sharp formality the occasion demanded. The goofy sight of him in that loose pajama top gave the impression of a sleepwalker having wandered into a funeral, or a clown into a church. Now, this eccentric behavior that Okawa displayed while walking into the courtroom continued after the trial began. As the court was reading the 55-count indictment against the Class A suspects, Okawa began fidgeting and muttering gibberish. He was bothering the defendants to his left and his right. He takes that inappropriate pajama top and starts sliding it down his shoulder, exposing his chest in an even more inappropriate way. And suddenly, out of nowhere, he leans forward, takes his hand, and he slaps Tojo Hideki right on the top of that famous flat bald head of his. Now, obviously, the courtroom kind of erupted into a bit of a commotion, and what does Okawa do in response? Well, he leans forward, and he slaps Tojo again. Now, at that point, they had to settle down the court. They took a little recess, and when they reconvened, the Chief Justice removed Okawa from the courtroom, and he ordered 2 psychiatrists, one from the Japanese side, one from the Allied side, to evaluate Okawa's legal competency to see if he could stand trial. A couple days later, the psychiatrists come back, and they have reached an agreement. Okawa clearly cannot stand trial. He's incompetent by legal standards, doesn't know right from wrong. In a word, he'd gone insane. So what the court did was they moved Okawa to a mental hospital to convalesce and hopefully get better. And as the trial proceeded and eventually the verdicts were handed down and the sentences were meted out, 7 of the Japanese Class A suspects were put to death, including Tojo. The rest began prison sentences that ranged up to life in jail. And wouldn't you know it, but a couple days after that, Okawa Shuemi leaves the mental hospital. He's looking fine, says he's feeling fine, and he gets to go home. In fact, as the Associated Press wrote at the time, he was the only one of the original 28 defendants to go free. Now, you might be wondering what my interest in this is, and it's very simple. My grandfather was the Allied psychiatrist who evaluated Okawa for the Tokyo trial. Now, that's this man here, Daniel Jaffe. He was a combat psychiatrist during the war. Moved over to Japan for the occupation afterward. Now, my grandfather didn't talk much about his war. He didn't talk much at all, as I will explain in a few minutes. But right before he died, he wrote up some memoirs of his time in the service. And these memoirs circulated throughout our family, and I got my hands on them, and I was able to read them. I was really mesmerized, really riveted by his description of this evaluation he conducted of Okawa for the Tokyo trial. And the most fascinating part of that most riveting section of these memoirs was when my grandfather revealed that some historians doubted his conclusions, which is to say, some historians believed Okawa had faked his insanity, deceived my grandfather, and thus escaped justice. Now, I never got to ask my grandfather about this before he died, but after he died, I took what you might call a rather unhealthy obsession in it. I started researching into the life of Okawa. I went to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. one day. I pulled the file on Okawa, and I'm flipping through it, and I come to a very interesting page drafted by the CIA in the late 1950s. The CIA had considered Okawa's case, considered the situation at the Tokyo trial, and they too believed that my grandfather had been deceived. The final words on that page were, "Suspected insanity was feigned." And this was kind of like an official state denial of my grandfather's position. And over time, as I did more research, I came across more and more doubters. There were articles from the Tokyo trial saying that people around the courtroom were whispering that Okawa had maybe staged an act. There was an interview given by one of the justices on the panel who said he actually believed that Okawa had, quote-unquote, deceived both the court and the psychiatrist. And there was an interview from Okawa himself given in the early 1950s after he'd been able to go home and live a calm, peaceful life, saying, "As I look back, there was nothing really ever seriously wrong with my mind." Now, this touched off, there were all these voices and opinions coming out on Okawa's side of this historical controversy, this historical mystery. And I felt there wasn't anybody speaking up for my grandfather's side. There were a few people, but least of which, my grandfather didn't get a chance to tell his side. He died before he had the chance to publish his memoirs. So I kind of made it my mission, if you will, to vindicate his evaluation and, in a sense, vindicate his legacy in our family. This touched off the 3+ years of research and writing that went into the book. And I was pretty sure as I started researching that I would vindicate my grandfather, because when I was growing up, all anybody ever told me about him was that he was a brilliant man. All I ever heard was that he had this enormously retentive mind. I mean, he could kind of absorb